Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 70 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. As the curtain rises, two noblemen are talking in the throne room of the King of Britain. They anticipate that the king will arrive shortly to conduct a formal ceremony in which he aims to announce his retirement, divide the kingdom among his three offspring, and arrange the betrothal of his youngest daughter. But all does not go according to his plan. The youngest daughter fails to satisfy her father's terms to secure her share of the kingdom and is banished forthwith. The patriarch's assumption that he may retain his royal prerogatives after passing on his powers to the two remaining daughters soon proves that managing succession in the family politic is never an easy business. The family is caught up in a bitter internecine battle that will sow chaos in the land and claim all of their lives. This is, of course, William Shakespeare's monumental tragedy, King Lear, a play that the poet Shelley called the most perfect specimen of the dramatic art existing in the world. Shakespeare probably wrote King Lear in 1605-06. The first recorded performance of the play was at the court of James I in the Great Chamber in Whitehall on St. Stephen's Day, or what we know as Boxing Day, in December 1606. That must have been a cheery festive fare for the relatively new king and the select audience of 300 who were privileged to see it. In fact, the play's dark story proved too bleak for many, as for 150 years from the late 17th century on, it was only presented in a corrupted version, which inserted a happy ending in which King Lear and his daughter Cordelia survive. Since 1838, when the original version of the play reasserted itself, the towering role of Lear himself has been assailed by every generation of leading actor. As we record this episode, a new production directed by and starring Sir Kenneth Branagh arrives in London's West End. Branagh is, of course, no stranger to Shakespeare, having directed and starred in 5 film adaptations as well as numerous stage performances. I have to confess to being not a little daunted to be taking on an examination of this immense play that has been the subject of centuries of critical study. It's a prodigious play in every sense. There are no fewer than 10 major roles. It has multiple significant plot lines, an elemental stormy setting, intense domestic conflict, and acts of war and violence, which roll on with a propulsive tragic energy and conjure a challenging philosophical vision. So I'm very pleased to be able to turn today to a properly qualified Shakespearean analyst. He is Paul Prescott, an academic, writer, and theater practitioner who has held positions at the University of Warwick and California. He has acted, adapted, and taught Shakespeare in a range of countries and contexts, and authored books including the Arden Performance edition of Othello, Reviewing Shakespeare, and co-edited Shakespeare on European Festival Stages, Shakespeare on the Global Stage, and A Year of Shakespeare. He is also the co-founder of the annual festival Shakespeare in Yosemite National Park in California, and has adapted many of Shakespeare's plays for a range of professional companies, including the National Theatre. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Paul. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me, Douglas. I'm daunted too. We're on the same page.
Oh, no. I need you, Paul.
One never loses the daunt with King Lear.
I think that's fair, actually. And I discovered as we connected tonight that you are in Stratford-on-Avon, and I think that's just too appropriate.
I am. I'm about 400 meters from the resting place. And, I've tried to initiate conversations, but so far with no luck.
Well, he speaks to us in other ways.
Indeed.
But I'll start with a personal question, which is, when did you first see or read King Lear, and what have been your most meaningful personal encounters with it?
Well, it went in early and it went in deep. I was about 13 years old. I never studied the play at school, but I was doing work experience teaching in a middle school, and we didn't get paid. But by way of remuneration, the very enlightened head teacher there said, "Look, I'm going to take you to see King Lear in Stratford." which is about as cheery as you say, as the Boxing Day experience, So I panicked and I bought a Penguin edition and I was boning up assiduously on it. And one day he came into the staff room and he gave me a brilliant piece of advice. He just said, put that down, let's just go and see it. And so we did, and it blew me away. And in some ways, it explains why I'm here today in Stratford, I think. And then, in a way, my adult life has been bookended by Lear, because the most memorable Lear I ever saw was just a few weeks ago. And it wasn't Ken Branagh's. It was a production in the Faroe Islands in the North Atlantic, and one that I had worked on in a small way, helping with the adaptation for a genius director who's called Boer Dam. And he used King Lear as a way of exploring his mother's condition of Alzheimer's. We haven't got time to go into how astonishing and moving this production was, but it redefined the play for me, as great performances often do.
It also suggests how universal this play is and how many different interpretations there can be, which we may cover a bit of in the time we have. My personal engagement with it is I did study it at school, but I confess to finding it hard to like at that age. It felt too bleak and brutal, I think. My teenage self related more to Hamlet than the Old Man of Lear, I think. But one of my highlights was seeing Sir Peter Ustinov as Lear at the Stratford Festival in Ontario, Canada. I have such a strong image of him, and particularly of him in the scene with Gloucester sitting on the beach. Ustinov was a powerful figure physically, but he was also a great comedian with precise use of language. So his descent into the quieter existential bewilderment was just very, very moving. But let's get some background. Where does Lear fit into the chronology and evolution of Shakespeare as a playwright? And I guess another question, what was happening in the world in 1605-6 that inspired or is reflected in this play?
Yeah, so as you said, we're looking at a composition date of about 1605, premiere of 1606. We are 3/4 of the way through Shakespeare's career. So Shakespeare writes plays for just 20 years or so, average of 2 a year. To say the least, he's an astonishing artist by this point. The style is fully mature Shakespeare. What's happening in the world? Well, two things, let's say plague and James the First of England and Scotland. I don't know if you remember during the first bit of COVID when we were all locking down, there was a kind of meme going around. Shakespeare wrote King Lear during lockdown. What are you going to do? Anyway, there is a feeling that certainly the theatres had closed a couple of times in 1605, there were major plague outbreaks. It is possible that this play was written, well, it is certain this play was written with a very great degree of consciousness of the plague, of the idea of end times, I think, diffuses this play. On the other hand, England has a relatively new king in King James, who's come down from Scotland and aims to unite the two kingdoms of England and Scotland. So you have a relatively new king who is patronizing your company, who gives his name to your company. Shakespeare's company becomes the King's Men. So it stands to reason that you might write plays that would be of interest to him. I don't think Shakespeare does this slavishly, but nevertheless, if you're choosing a story about a king who divides a kingdom rather than combines and unites a kingdom, then that would presumably pique your key audience members' interest, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you say about where he is in his career, it is relatively late on, I suppose. He's been incredibly prolific to this point, written 28 plays by then, sometimes producing 3 or even 4 a year. But in the last 5 years previous to this, slightly less prolific. And maybe the change in the monarch and the political landscape, he may have just taken some time to come to terms with it, because he generally did write things that responded to what was happening in the world at the time. And as you suggest, King James coming to the throne, there is, of course, an active succession itself in that, which is very much part of what goes on in Lear. And the unity of the kingdoms of Scotland and England was very much on James's agenda, so that this play showing the perils of dissolution would likely have been welcomed by the monarch.
Absolutely, because James is having problems with both the Scottish and the English parliaments about this unification idea. So, every little helps.
Yeah. What age is Shakespeare at? He's 42 years old, which to us doesn't sound like anything. But of course, life expectancy was much shorter then. He actually died a decade later, and many of the other players in the company of the King's Men were also aging with him.
Yeah.
So Richard Burbage, who played Lear initially, and I presume he wrote the part for, was also a similar age. And so maybe there's something just as simple as he's getting older and the people he works with around him are getting older.
Yes, possibly. I mean, the life expectancy thing is always qualified by the amount of infant mortality. So it was possible to live to a ripe old age at that time. But certainly, I think he would have felt very middle-aged at least. And he's probably having problems with his kids and stuff.
Yeah. So there's another generation coming thing. That might be some of that.
Yeah.
Shakespeare was famous for lifting the plots of his plays from other existing sources, I believe, and making them into something all of his own. So I wonder if there were precedents for the story or stories that we see in King Lear, and if so, what were they?
Yeah, there were loads of precedents. I mean, on one level, you've got a kind of historical precedent. I mean, everyone should know that King Lear never existed, right? It's a made-up king from roughly 800 BC. So it's a Celtic myth that seems to find its first instance in a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth in the Middle Ages, who writes about Lear and gives us the outline of the plot. And then that's taken up by subsequent historians, including Holinshed, who Shakespeare used for all of his history plays and so on. On the other hand, it's a fairy tale. It's a very old story, as old as time. And there is a particular myth or fairy tale called Love Like Salt, which basically gives you the bare bones of King Lear. And that had been circulating around Europe for centuries, probably. And of course, many people, when they see King Lear for the first time, will think, hey, this is a bit like Cinderella or something. Of course, the Cinderella story is pretty ancient as well, and derives from Love Like Salt. And then we should also say that there was an anonymously written play called Chronicle History of King Lear, but spelled Leir. Let's call it Lear. But in Lear, that had played on the London stages at least a few years before Shakespeare wrote his play. And we can read that play. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can. And the first thing anyone would notice at the end is that it ends happily. And indeed, all of the stories that Shakespeare inherited and maybe consulted end happily, with the king realizing the error of his ways, a reunion with the daughter who's annoyed him, but who is prepared to forgive him. So the point is that when Shakespeare's audience went to see this play, if they'd read anything about Lear, if they'd seen the Lear play, they are not expecting what happens at the end.
No, nor if they thought of Cinderella.
Yeah, no, totally. And I was just thinking this afternoon that it's quite often asked the question, well, why does he make it an apocalyptic ending?
Well, wait, now I've got to stop you there because we don't want to jump right to the ending now.
Okay, all right.
But we will come back to that. So, yes, so he had various precursors, but obviously he shaped it differently.
Very. And he introduces a subplot.
Yes.
Of this new family, the Gloucester and his two sons. So he makes it even more interesting and difficult for himself.
Yes, because they were not in these earlier versions. In fact, did he not find the story of Gloucester and his sons is in Philip Sidney's Arcadia? Yeah.
He takes an amazing detail from Arcadia, an image really of a blind man being led by his son through a storm in a wood. And he runs with that image entirely. But I think just to break it down, in none of the precedents, there's no madness, there's no fool, there's no sustained storm scene. So the things he adds are remarkable.
Yes, I mean, even just to pick little details and then put it all together, extraordinary. Let's move on to the text then, what he did actually write. As with many of Shakespeare's plays, there are questions about what the definitive version of the text of the play is. I believe there are two main original, in inverted commas, editions of King Lear that survive. Can you tell us a bit about what these are and what we're to make of the text that we do have?
Yeah, certainly. So there are two versions, one published in 1608 during Shakespeare's lifetime in the cheaper paperback quarto edition, and then one published after he died in the folio of 1623, the more deluxe version of Shakespeare, the first ever complete works, which are the 400th anniversary of which we're celebrating this year. So you've got two different versions. This is true of many of Shakespeare's plays. What's distinctive about King Lear is that these versions have many, many, many dissimilarities. We're talking about hundreds of differences between the two texts. And what had been standard editorial practice for centuries was to say, okay, we've got these two different texts. And in a sense, the editor would say, well, which one do I prefer for this line? And the editor would choose a version of the line. But basically, it became a matter of taste as to which line was better than the other line. And they would conflate. So what you'd end up with was a conflated version. So that Penguin edition that I read in my teenage naivety, that was presented to me as King Lear, as it were. Now, what happened in the 1980s was a bunch of scholars said, oh, hold on. These differences are so profound. They must be evidence of a rethink on Shakespeare's part or revision on the part of the company. What we have are two snapshots of a text in time, but they're actually kind of incommensurable. They're different things. And this became the kind of poster child for a new approach to editing Shakespeare that wanted to foreground the idea that he did revise his own plays, that the idea of a master text was an illusion. And so the Oxford Shakespeare edition of the late 80s, which really pioneered this approach, went so far as to print both texts. Now, they are still, in a sense, philosophically the same play, I think. But the options they provide for theatre makers are really interesting. Can I just give you an example that will have to stand in for loads? So King Lear's dying speech.
Yeah, so there are different endings, right, in very specific terms.
Right. So in the quarto, the first version that was published, he says, "And my poor fool is hanged. No life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou come no more. Never, never, never. Pray you undo this button. Thank you, sir." And then he dies by saying the letter O 4 times. So he's groaning to death. Okay. In the folio version, which may be a revision or maybe an earlier version, we don't exactly know, we get all of that. But when you come to that line, "O thou come no more," it now reads never, 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 never. He adds 2 more nevers to make it a full iambic pentameter line, and one of the craziest lines he ever wrote. "Pray you undo this button. Thank you, sir." Now, instead of the "O groaning death," Lear says, "Oh, do you see this? Look on her. Look, her lips. Look there. Look there." So the potential being that he dies sort of thinking that Cordelia might still be alive.
Yes.
Right. So, that's pretty big difference.
It is. As you say, it doesn't change the facts of what's happening, but actually you're right. The nuance of that is important. We're jumping way to the end here, but I think that the idea that he has for a moment, the illusory idea that Cordelia might still be alive, is even more heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And that the 5 nevers as well, which also are just, as you say, the most extraordinary line. The Arden edition also shows you the exact differences between the quarto and the folio, and you can sort of read them simultaneously. And the footnote on that line, the Arden edition describes as perhaps the most extraordinary blank verse line in English poetry. And I think he's not far off, because the slow rhythm of that line is just so distended, and it means the moment just hangs there.
Oh, God, yeah.
And it hammers home the inescapable reality of the oblivion of death.
No, it totally does. It totally does. There's no coming back from that.
So the gist of what you were saying as well is that we have 2 versions, but there is no definitive text.
Correct.
And we don't know how much Shakespeare played a part in revising or not. Scholars have spent a lot of time trying to figure out where the sources are for these published editions. But in the end, you sort of think, well, it's a live text.
It's absolutely live text. The text belongs to the theatre, the text belongs to cinema, the text belongs to anyone who wants to make it new. I mean, I mentioned that production in the Faroe Islands. That show was in Faroese. We won't have time to go into all of the multiple spin-offs of this play globally, but, a vast majority of them are not in English.
Well, in the way that Shakespeare himself, as we've said already, adapted material from whatever source, and this is long out of copyright, of course, so Yes, do with it what you will. And I think he would approve of that. Paul, for those listeners who are less familiar with the play, and for any who would welcome a refresher, perhaps we could give a very brief synopsis of what happens. I know we've jumped and spoiled the ending already.
Yeah, let's give it a go. So you have a king of ancient Britain nearing the end of his life, wants to resign, calls his 3 daughters to him, says, okay, I'm basically going to give you each a third, but just tell me how much you love me. 2 of the daughters step up, say how much they love him. He's like, great, here you are. 3rd daughter is his favorite, Cordelia, fails the test.
She says nothing.
She says, I have no answer to this, basically. Yes, nothing. So his fuse is lit and he banishes her. And one of his noblemen, Kent, says, you're crazy to do this. So he banishes Kent as well. So we have 2 refugees. Meanwhile, we've got another family, which is Gloucester. And Gloucester has 2 sons, one of whom is a legitimate son, Edgar, and one of whom is a bastard, genetically and behaviorally. And he's called Edmund. And Edmund has been, in effect, disinherited. He's not in line to inherit anything, so he decides he's going to trick his father into thinking that Edgar, the legitimate son, is after his life, fakes some letters. The father is stupid and credulous, believes him. So Edgar is now on the run. So we have 3 people on the run. Lear has decided that in his retirement, he will split his time between his 2 remaining daughters, spending a month at each one's place, bringing with him 100 knights and everything that goes with that. And it's a nightmare for his eldest daughter, Goneril. She just can't put up with it. And he goes mad again and says some terrible things to her and says, well, I'll go to Regan. I'll go to the other daughter. He goes to Regan. And Regan also is not particularly happy with the arrival of these drunk, violent 100 knights. And the 2 daughters, in effect, team up and say, look, why do you need all this stuff? We can look after you. And he says, well, reason not the need. And everything just spirals down. Those relationships get very, very messy. And a storm starts. And the girls have had enough of him. And they say, all right, we're going to lock the gates on you and leave you in this storm. And so the central action of the play consists of Lear becoming more and more unhinged, accompanied by his fool, who I guess we'll talk about later, Kent in disguise, this loyal person in disguise, and now Edgar in disguise, as well as a madman and homeless person, poor Tom. So you just have this remarkable set of scenes where it goes incredibly surreal.
Yes, they run into each other on the moor in the storm.
They all come together beautifully and terrifyingly, and the play becomes almost utterly unhinged because it's very hard to tell who is mad and who is feigning madness. And then to cap it all off, the Earl of Gloucester has heard that Cordelia is going to come back and help her father. And the Earl of Gloucester has said to the bastard Edmund, we've got to side with the king, not with the girls and their husbands, Albany and Cornwall. Edmund betrays him. Gloucester's eyes are therefore put out. And so Gloucester joins the madness outdoors as a blind man speaking to a madman, the king. How are we doing? We're getting there.
Good. Yeah, keep going.
Cordelia eventually comes back.
At the head of the French army to reclaim the throne on behalf of Lear.
Yeah, and the worst of Lear's lunacy is over, and he has a very affecting reunion with Cordelia, and now we're in battle. And the combined armies of Albany and Cornwall, i.e. at that point it's the whole of Britain, versus France, and it doesn't go well.
No. At that point you think maybe the good guys will win, but they don't. So the powers from France and Cordelia lose the battle. Cordelia and Lear are then captured.
Yeah, and meanwhile, just a little footnote, Gloucester has been taken up by his son, Edgar, in disguise as poor Tom, and all Gloucester wants to do is die. And so he says to his son, please take me to Dover, I want to jump off a cliff. And Edgar stage manages that for him so that Gloucester thinks he's committing suicide, but actually doesn't. And they have a very touching reunion as well, which is reported, not seen really. But Gloucester has died by the time we get to the end of the play.
Edmund, having won the battle, issues the order for the killing of Cordelia and Lear in prison.
Yes. Edmund, meanwhile, has been having sex with both of the other sisters. And so that's put the sisters against each other. And so they, in effect, kill each other. But yeah, there's this glimpse of hope that Edmund has sent a reversal of the order, and will it get there in time? And everyone's expecting, I guess, in 1606 or so, that it will arrive in time and that we will see Lear and Cordelia alive again. But instead, what we get is the harrowing image of the old man carrying the limp body of his daughter on the stage and howling. But as we've just seen with that extract, there's a sense in which Shakespeare is always trying to say, no, she might come back, but then she doesn't. And really then everyone, the people left on stage are just utterly traumatized. Kent, Albany, Edgar. This is the promised end. This is the way the world ends.
Yes.
I think there are interesting questions to ask about why it is that all the women in this play die. There is a strand of misogyny throughout the imagination of this play, but particularly in Lear's mind, that I think is very troubling, really.
Yes, because he blames everything on the women, doesn't he? And he has some startling speeches.
Well, indeed, absolutely obnoxious.
Because he's been betrayed by his daughters initially as he sees them.
As he sees it, yes. And this is one of the interesting questions about the play, is how much we can temper Lear's perspective with an imaginative and empathetic perspective for others in the play.
Yes. Interestingly, I was thinking about the deaths of the three daughters is partly, I think, structurally, it brings the play full circle back to the opening scene where it started, and it's all been initiated by this crazy plan of Lear's. And I wanted to talk to you about the structure of the play, because as you say, one of the significant features that Shakespeare added to the source story was the storyline of Gloucester and his sons, which in effect creates parallel plots. And I wanted to ask you how that works. How does that increase the impact of the themes in the play, for example, and the way that he interweaves these plots?
Yeah. It's interesting to think that plays like Macbeth and Othello don't really have subplots. It adds enormous amounts because, even a character like Edmund introduces a bracing kind of energy to, in a sense, the philosophical inquiry about the play, the politics of it, what inheriting something is about. And in a sense, Shakespeare and drama always works by foils and counterfoils. So Edgar is the dutiful son that matches Cordelia on the other side.
You're right. There are doubling and contrasts going on, aren't there?
Yeah. When Edmund then steps forward and says, this is who I am, and I'm going to buck the system here because I'm much more interesting and sexy and intelligent than my boring brother Edgar, who's due to inherit all this land. So he voices a kind of bracing individualism that says, superstition, respect for parents, that's all nonsense.
Yes, we have two generations in both families who are assailing the authority of their elders.
Yeah, and not without reason.
No, believing them no longer fit to retain their power in some form, maybe, or that their time is due. And he very cleverly knits these two together. It brings the plot lines together of the two different families who have this similar dynamic going on. And I think they double the impact. It makes the behavior seem more universal if there's just more of it in a simple way.
I think it also makes it more symphonic. It also makes it more about theme and variation. So it's not necessarily that the play is putting forward one argument or one story about these relationships. It's saying, hey, we'll think about this idea in a different key and modulate it slightly differently. Isn't that interesting? And what are the dissonances actually between the plot and subplot as well?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yes, exactly. And the play operates also on several levels, doesn't it? Because in the opening scene, for example, Lear's challenge to his daughters is both political and personal in their being asked in a political setting, and yet it's being determined on the basis of how much do you love me in personal terms.
I suppose we never lose sight of the fact the question is insane that he poses to them. There's one story of Lear, which is that he becomes crazier and crazier, but he's nuts to start with. The idea to quantify love is clearly nuts.
Yeah. And actually, one of the themes is about speaking truth or not. There's a very specific line at the end of the play, of course.
The weight of these sad times we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. Well, has he seen the play?
Yes.
That's what Cordelia did. She gave a very honest and robust answer, pointing out the logical fallacies of Lear's question. And it led to an absolute Armageddon.
So those who spoke truthfully did not prosper.
Well, no, the fool, good example. The fool doesn't do so well out of truth-telling. Kent just about survives.
Well, he was banished for speaking truth to power.
Well, he was banished for speaking truth, and then he wiggled his way out of that and came back into the play.
You've mentioned a few times, I think, that the sort of sense of chaos and energy in the play. There's something about the pace, the dynamism of what's going on as well. It just all falls apart incredibly quickly, it feels like. And huge forces going on, almost like Greek tragedy. There's a sense, isn't there, of inevitability about the arc of events as well, that once Lear starts this thing, we feel like it's only going one way.
I don't know.
You don't think so?
No, not necessarily, because given that all of the other versions of this story ended happily, in effect, I think there is always scope for feeling like, well, this might work its way out. Of course, we can't unknow what we know about this play.
Yes.
And in a sense, all of our feelings about it are reverse engineered from the final apocalypse.
Also possibly informed by our worldview.
Well, yes, that's true. And I mean, I think there we can touch on the fact that what Shakespeare does also is to foreground the fact that this is a pre-Christian society. So in the Lear play, the earlier play, there was a sense of God, singular, and a Christian God intervening. And for whatever reason, Shakespeare leans into the fact that this is a long time before the coming of Christ. And you might say, therefore, that in that respect, there are cues there are indicators to Shakespeare's early audience that these people are not going to be saved.
And when I think in relation to gods, it feels like this is a world without any gods.
Well, it's got too many.
Yeah, well, there are lots of references, but they're none very positive that one would put any faith in. Gloucester blames the gods, but we really don't think there's any controlling agency going on here, do we?
No, I know. And of course, in a weird way, that's what feels so modern about the play.
Yes.
This is one of the reasons why Lear has become probably the most valued tragedy of the post-Second World War period, at least in Europe and America, and particularly in Europe.
You're right. This sense of a world disintegrating and there not being any moral certainties, and certainly not in Christian terms. And we have all sorts of chaos going on here. And the moral desolation is reflected in the landscape, the empty landscape, where there's scarce a bush. So associations are made by critics with the absurdist existence portrayed in, say, Samuel Beckett's theater, for example. Is that a plausible or useful comparison, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the great works of 20th century Shakespeare criticism is Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, by the Polish critic Jan Kot, which came out in the 60s. And Kot wrote an essay in that book comparing King Lear to Samuel Beckett's Endgame, in a sense saying, you know, what both plays show us is figures trapped in an absurd and ultimately meaningless world. But there's also that farcical aspect to absurdism. I mean, so Gloucester's imaginary fall kind of makes perfect sense after absurdism and after surrealism and so on. But ultimately, you know, we're looking at the Holocaust, we're looking at Hiroshima, in the first instance, as retuning people to the despair of King Lear. R.A. Folks, who compiled the Arden edition brilliantly, that you just referred to earlier, also wrote a book called Hamlet versus Lear.
Ah, great title.
It is, isn't it? It makes it like a football game, which I would pay to see.
I'd buy that, yeah.
Yeah. So to simplify, his argument is that if Hamlet was the play of the 19th century, of the romantics, of the individual, and sort of unfettered imagination and consciousness and so on, Lear became the play of the 20th century de facto after the Second World War. And I think that's kind of incontrovertible. And it speaks to a wider truth about all artworks, that they are restless and unfixed and will always be rewritten and rethought about from generation to generation. And I think Lear now not only resonates in terms of the painful last 70 years of trying to process the traumas of the mid-20th century, but I think there's also something in it about climate change and about our relationship with the natural world and the kind of the whole anthropocentric myth that we are superior to animals, for example. The play puts that idea under severe stress. You know, when Albany says humanity must perforce prey upon itself like monsters of the deep, I think in Shakespeare's time, to compare someone to a monster or an animal, which is happening all the way through King Lear, it's absolutely saturated in these cross-species comparisons and insults. I think in Shakespeare's time, broadly, there's a sense of the great ladder and great chain of being, and that humans are superior to animals, and that to descend to the level of animals is indeed a descent. But I think now, when we see what we are doing to this planet, we have done to this planet, I think it really, really questions that assumption of superiority. And so I hear Lear differently now, because I think when Lear says over Cordelia's corpse, why should a dog, a rat, a horse have life and thou have none? Part of me thinks, well, hold on, dogs and rats and horses are not the problem here. We're the only species who have brought around the promised end.
Only humans could mess it up this badly.
Yes, precisely.
And also there's a quote, something along the lines of, is this all man is? Basically, everything's stripped down. I mean, literally, Lear is virtually naked on the moor. All of the structures that support civilization are blown away.
Yes.
And I was going to say that with the benefit, of course, the hindsight of having Beckett's theatre in mind, there are lines that just seem to jump out that resonate with Beckett's own language. So even Lear's line at the very start of the play that he will unburden crawl towards death is an unexpectedly chilling sort of image. And then he talks at one page during his madness about when we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools. We came crying hither, thou knowest the first time that we smell the air, we wail and cry. And Edgar says, men must endure their going hence, even as they're coming hither. And all these things, I just kept thinking of Pozzo and Godot, they give birth astride a grave.
Yeah.
And in the same speech, I went and looked at that this week. He talks about we're all born mad.
Yeah.
Some remain so. And of course, Pozzo is blind. One day I went blind, and one day we shall die. And when we see Lear and others literally stumbling about blindly in a hostile world, it's a pretty nihilistic vision, isn't it? And I also picked up in various criticisms that this is underlined by the repeated use of the word nothing throughout the play. Nothing appears more than 30 times, starting with Cordelia, as we said at the very beginning, saying nothing, and Lear saying nothing will come of nothing. Well, nothing does come of that nothing, clearly. There's a vacuum of power, but most significantly, I suppose, all moral certainties or comfort seem to be gone, and Gloucester cries, all dark and comfortless. Is there anything more positive said against this nihilism, Paul, do you think, in the play? In Shakespeare's vision? Well, long pause.
Well, I feel like I'd be grasping at straws a bit there.
It's interesting what you had talked earlier about the pre-Christian, because there have been some people trying to suggest the idea that Cordelia offers some form of Christian redemption for Lear in the world. She represents love. She becomes a saintly martyr of some sort. But of course, as we've said, there's very little evidence of any faith in any kind of benign God in the world. But, I mean, what do we have? The power of her love. Somehow that has an impact on her father in his journey in the play.
I suppose it depends on whether you take comfort from martyrs or not. And I'm not sure I do.
No, they don't prosper. You're right. And what are the values represented by Gloucester's loyalty or Kent's loyalty and bravery? Or am I clutching at straws too here? Probably.
Yeah. Let's give this a go. I think there are moments along the way that are life affirming. I think of the line that Edgar says to his father after the father thinks he's fallen off this cliff, and Edgar assumes a different persona and says, blimey, I just saw you fall off that cliff. How are you still alive? He says, thy life's a miracle, he says to his father. There are moments like that that are heart-rendingly beautiful.
Yeah, it's kind of, humans hang in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Life is, there's something. Stay with us.
Yeah, stay a while. Yeah. Some of the insights that are granted to Lear in his abjection are useful and would be positive if he'd have had time to act on them afterwards, I think politically particularly.
Can we talk a little bit about some of the main characters, starting with Lear? Why does he decide to give his kingdom away? Because in so many respects, he doesn't seem ready to do so.
Well, Shakespeare often uses a kind of strategic ambiguity about motivation. and a kind of gappiness, as our great friend Emma Smith would say. He leaves these intentional gaps. So it's not really explained. If you look at the earlier play, the Lear play, he comes on and says, "Oh, my wife's just died. That's sad. I've got 3 daughters. I don't really understand them. I don't spend any time with them. I wish I had a son, because then this whole transition thing would be easier." Psychologically, it's very, very thin. But at least there's something there. He says, this is what's going on.
Yeah, because there's no exposition giving any background to why he's reached this point. When you realize that, you realize how effective that is to unsettling the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And his only comment is that future strife may be prevented. But the irony, of course, is that he incites the very thing he fears.
No, he thinks what's going to happen is that he will retire and live with Cordelia. Now, psychoanalytically, a lot of people have been interested in that, and various adaptations have tried to fill in a backstory. So you have a novel like Jane Smiley's A Thousand Acres, where there's a history of sexual abuse between the father and the elder sisters. So what she's doing there and what other people are doing is trying to fill the gappiness.
What about age? Can I ask you about age then? Because he himself refers to his being old, and the other characters do, and Goneril and Regan to the infirmity of his age. And they attribute some rashness and wayward behavior to that as well. And you mentioned the Faroe Islands production. There are readings that perhaps you could postulate that he is already beginning to sense himself, or others have.
Yeah, a form of dementia or something, yeah.
Or signs of declining power in some way.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he seems incredibly vigorous.
Well, he's vigorous enough to curse people and to lose his temper. And I think probably everyone knows someone old or young who's like that. One of the sisters says, he hath ever but slenderly known himself. That seems about right. If you think about something like the TV show Succession, which is a clear offshoot of King Lear, Logan Roy is clearly someone who has always had a short fuse and always been manipulative about the way he responds to his offspring and maneuvers them around and manipulates them. I mean, one of the first Lears I saw was Brian Cox at National Theatre. And so, when I watched Succession, the two things kind of overlap really strongly.
And you have that, of course, the classic not finding it easy to give it up.
Yes, the Murdoch problem.
Exactly. As Goneril says, he still would manage those authorities that he's given away.
Yeah.
He won't let go. And as you say, he could be an enormously difficult man to live with. And you do get the sense that his action is precipitate in some way, don't you, at the start of the play, and that it's his own plan. He hasn't consulted people.
And I think you're right, because the idea of consultation, going back to that Lear play again as well, the earlier play, the opening scene is King Lear with a couple of advisors saying, "What do you think of this?" And he's got one evil advisor and one benign advisor, right? And I think Shakespeare just thought, that's too boring. That over-explains.
Leave gaps.
Leave gaps. Mind the gap.
Yes. How about if there are signs potentially that he hasn't got a complete grip from the off? One of the challenges always struck me in the play and the part is to comprehend how this king descends to the madness he does. Where do you think it comes from? How do we chart it plausibly that he gets to where he gets to?
There's a moment when he says, "Is there any cause in nature that makes these hard hearts?" about his 2 daughters. Is there any cause in nature? And I don't know, if Lear's madness, I suppose my personal feeling, if I'm trying to track between the play and what we actually know of people and people we observe in real life, which we can't help doing, as naive as it might be, but that's how drama works. He seems to me a type of person who was probably always angry.
You know what? There's a quote I often think of. James Joyce apparently said somewhere, I think, that all anger is anger with yourself. It's about your own fallibilities or your own weakness or your inability to change the state of the world the way you want it to be. And whose fault is that?
Yeah.
You have got yourself into this position yourself somehow.
Yeah. A secure person does not go around asking people how much they love him.
It struck me that he has a vertiginous fall from power, both within his family and as the king. And all of these things, of course, define his identity. And as these things are torn away from him incredibly rapidly, when he cries out, "Let me not be mad," even before I think he actually is in overt terms, it seems to me an expression that all is spinning away from him. And it's existential in the sense that he's stripped of everything that defines his existence, his authority, his position in the family, his soldiers, his house, even his clothes, ultimately. And therefore, when he says, "Who is it that can tell me who I am?" it's almost like a cry of, who am I now?
Yes, it's a kind of supercharged version of what many people feel when they retire from their jobs. Astronomically heightened.
Yes, as well as, of course, they talk about the grief at the betrayal of his daughters, and there's the parallel with Gloucester, who also has a grief hath crazed his wits. The sources of their so-called grief is from the betrayals of their children. Lear's madness itself, do we see any redeeming features? Are there some moments you mentioned earlier where he actually demonstrates some clear thinking?
Yeah, well, when he says he has that prayer, in effect, to the poor naked wretches, suddenly thinks about the millions or thousands of people that he's actually responsible for, and thinks about the homeless. And, I have taken too little care of this. I mean, it's very rare to hear a political leader say anything like that.
And when he's with Gloucester on the beach, which I think is one of my favorite scenes in all of theater somehow, because the two men there's a moment of quiet in this craziness, and they're both crazy ostensibly, but actually speak some truth. Lear makes some moral observations about the world, which are basically truths.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Gloucester's line about distribution shall undo excess and each man have enough. There shouldn't be unequal distribution of resources in a society.
Any idea that the world's going to be shaped by them seems a long way from happening, though.
Alas, no, that's right. But you were kind of asking about some of the fringe benefits of insanity. But, there are some downsides too, in that it seems to completely unleash Lear's misogyny. That becomes utterly unfettered.
We talked earlier about the fool. What role does he play in the play? And particularly also, what about the relationship between the fool and Lear?
I mean, the fool is Shakespeare's insertion into the story, as it were. He's another truth teller. You've got a kind of trio of truth tellers, Kent and Cordelia and the fool. And of course, there's conjecture about whether the fool and Cordelia were originally doubled in performance. It's very easily doable, and Ken Branagh's production is doing it at the moment in London. The fool is a fact of Jacobean life. King James has a fool, Archie Armstrong. It sounds like a music hall act to me.
It does,
quite appropriately, yeah. The idea is that, of course, the fool is licensed to speak truth to power. And yet, it's interesting because I don't think he is all licensed as he's described, in the sense that Lear can whip him whenever he likes. At one point, Lear says, "Take heed, sirrah, the whip." That can't be an empty threat.
No, I think you always have the sense that, well, firstly, they're couching a lot of that in riddles that they may or may not just get away with. But also there will be a moment when he just has to skip away, just get out of harm's way.
Beyond the whip's length, yeah.
Yeah, literally, physically, or actually by somehow backing off or whatever. But there are other times where it feels sort of tender between them. It depends the way it's played. Lear seems to want him around. It becomes a bit childish, and it's certainly a little bit comic. There's some lightness in it, which there isn't a lot of in the play.
Yeah, very much depends on how it's done, who's cast in the role, at what age they are. You can see productions where the fool and Lear are basically contemporaries.
Yes, that was the case in the Sir Peter Ustinov one I saw in Canada, which worked really well, I thought, actually. So why does the fool disappear halfway through the play? And then at the very end, we have this very brief, shocking report that he's hanged himself.
There's a number of ways of answering that. One is that the actor who played the fool needed to come back as Cordelia in Act 4. So that's the pragmatic showbiz response. I think the more philosophical response, but they could both be true, is that Lear actually learns more from the storm and from poor Tom than he can learn from the fool. It's almost like he's exhausted what he can learn from the fool. Fool's even telling him, you screwed up, you screwed up, you screwed up.
You have no more need of the fool. And in fact, ironically, in some respects, Lear then plays the fool to Gloucester in that scene we just talked about on the beach.
Well, there's a rather nice moment, sweet moment, when they're going into the hovel and Lear says to the fool, you go in first, boy. And there's some kind of biblical echo to that about the first shall be last and the last shall be first, whatever, But the care, it's almost like he's had that speech about most abject people in his kingdom, and he actually sees the fool as someone, yes, I need to actually look after you, not you constantly dancing attendance on me. And that's the last we see of the fool. I don't know, this is a little bit scurrilous, but I'm always quite relieved when the fool leaves the play. I'm kind of quite sympathetic to Goneril. It's like, bloody, really? Do we need this guy around all the time?
Especially if they start singing. Can we talk about the women briefly? You raised some really interesting questions about, I suppose, the moral balance in the behavior of Goneril and Regan toward their father, and that, there is a world where some of this is reasonable.
Yeah.
Complaining about his retinue of soldiers and his behavior being querulous and difficult and all of that. But, as the play unfolds, they display some pretty horrific behavior. Cruelty to Gloucester, for example. And then I think the balance is tipped a little more when they end up scrabbling over Edmund. We have Goneril is plotting to kill her own husband and replace him with Edmund.
Well, I mean, who can blame her?
What is Albany too dull? What is that about?
She says, look at the difference between man and man.
Paul, that is too scurrilous. Surely.
Okay, I'll rein it in. All right. So Goneril and Regan, the stereotype role, in a sense, that is their destiny, is the wicked sisters, as we've talked about in terms of fairy tale and so on. So I think our focus should be on what ameliorates or complicates that picture. And as you were saying it just then, I do wonder if it weren't for the fact that Regan is directly involved in removing Gloucester's eyes, if it weren't for that, what would we think of them? Because in a sense, that is the point of maximal cruelty in this play.
Yes, and others step up and call that out, don't they? And even before they do it, Regan says, hang him instantly, and Goneril pluck out his eyes, which presumably gives them the idea.
Yes, it seems to be her idea. I mean, Regan is married to a psychopath, the fiery Duke Cornwall. He's a nutter. So these two female characters, it is their destiny to be the wicked sisters. The question is how much Shakespeare loads, not in their favour, but that mitigates that. I mean, I always think here about Peter Brook's landmark production down the road here in Stratford, decades and decades ago.
62, I think, was it?
62. Exactly. And Kenneth Tynan's review of that production, where he said the genius here of this production is that he has reinterpreted Lear from a standpoint of moral neutrality, i.e. that Brooke was one of the first theatre directors to take seriously what a pain Lear and his 100 Knights are, and not to assume that anyone is absolutely wicked or absolutely good.
Yeah, and there's certainly an argument that Lear has brought much of it on himself.
Well, totally. And what drives me crazy in productions is casting. There is a default way of casting the three sisters, where Goneril and Regan could be played by actors in their 40s. Cordelia is always 23 and she's just come out of drama school and she's got blonde hair.
That's right, yes.
And Goneril and Regan are brunettes.
Yes.
Usually. That drives me nuts. Of all the boring, ageist, misogynist stereotypes, chromatic stereotypes,
It's interesting you say that, because thinking of Cordelia, mainly I think of this as a rather thankless part, and she's almost too saintly. And, if I were the actor cast of Cordelia, I'd certainly welcome the opportunity to also play the fool.
Yeah.
It would be much more fun. And I mean, as you've just suggested pragmatically, you weren't stuck in the dressing room for much of the play.
Yeah.
But of course, she is a central figure to the arc of the play, despite her actually appearing pretty infrequently. She is some symbol of good, isn't she? Of goodness, love and devotion, kindness. Some symbol that if she returns, the world out of joint will be restabilized. And then even, as I said earlier, she may even offer Lear some kind of redemption, some understanding about his failures towards her and others. But yeah, she's pretty boring compared to the others. I'm getting scurrilous now.
Yes, it's contagious. It is the time's plague. Yeah. Well, yes, I think it's a difficult role for an actor to play satisfyingly. I have seen productions, very free adaptations, that in effect rewrite the opening scene to capture some of the weirdness of this person who doesn't play ball. Because that's interesting.
It is interesting, because it'd be pretty obvious what she needs to do.
Yeah.
Talking about moral neutrality, here's my attempted link to the next bit about Gloucester. Does he deserve in any way what happens to him?
Well, I think it's hard to say that anyone deserves to have their eyes plucked out.
True.
But he is an idiot. He is gullible. He is like Lear, like Cornwall, fiery.
Yes, he dismisses Edgar without even a trial, so to speak.
Yeah, no, he's part of the critique of this elder generation. Yeah, of course he doesn't deserve what happens to him. But then again, I was just thinking about the idea of being a traitor. It's not long since the gunpowder plot, for example. If we just really, really neutralize this and think from Cornwall and Regan's perspective, this guy is siding with an alien army invading your country. Now, the standard response to that in Jacobean Elizabethan England is not to put them on a kind of self-awareness course. It's to torture them, right? Wherefore to Dover? Let him answer that. So this is not kind of outrageous behavior.
What about the boys? Very quickly, Edmund and Edgar. I think we said earlier that Edgar is an apparent good son, but also perhaps like Cordelia, a bit dull, especially initially, and somewhat naive.
He's certainly credulous.
Too easily tricked by Edmund initially. But he does seem to gain some stature and identity through his experiences thrown out into the world.
Absolutely.
But one of the big questions is, why does he not simply identify himself to his father, rather than putting him through the charade of accompanying Gloucester to the edge of the imaginary cliff at Dover? He says he's going to cure his despair, but it's a bit hard to see how that's actually meant to work. It's more just so that he can do this wonderful scene, which is a wonderful scene.
Yeah, well, I think that might be the answer.
Okay.
Is that why would you lose that astonishing moment of stagecraft? But the payoff is thy life is a miracle. I mean, I think we're supposed to realize that that's what he was working all the way towards, that moment when he could say to his father, actually, your life is still valuable.
By contrast, we have Edmund, who is more a wickedly enjoyable character, I guess.
Love Edmund. Yeah, of course.
Like other Shakespearean villains, we relish their sharing their evil plans and speaking directly to us.
Yes, there isn't much direct address in this play, and it's weird that King Lear himself doesn't address the audience or doesn't have soliloquy. That privilege is given to Edmund. And of course, that aligns him with the other great kind of Machiavellian vice figures of Richard III and Iago and so on. So Act 1, Scene 2, soliloquy is saying to the audience, hey, here's your vice figure. Here's the guy you're going to enjoy watching try to get to the top. But I mean, I feel there's something poignant about his closing. I don't mean about his some good I mean to do and reversing the order, because that never seems very plausible. But when he says, and yet Edmund was beloved, I think that's just fascinating, because in a sense, it takes us back to the beginning of the play, to Gloucester, his father's utter disregard and contempt, really, for this boy. And of course, that boy, like Lear, is going to seek love. He's going to try and find it somewhere. And presumably at the beginning, he thinks, well, I do that through power. I do that through getting lands. And then he comes into this orbit. Well, he's probably always known those girls at a distance, Goneril and Regan. But when they start getting turned on by him, there's something like love. And I find it very moving that he says, well, I'm checking out now, but at least I've gained a modicum of love.
And of course, there's this transference, isn't there, when Cornwall offers that he will prosper under Cornwall's wing. And there's almost like a transference of the father figure there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at that moment, Edmund becomes his dad because he's Duke of Gloucester.
Yes, exactly. There's so much we could talk about, but let's just talk about the ending. As we've said, many did not expect this ending. This was Shakespeare's invention. James Shapiro, who wrote a fantastic book, 1606, William Shakespeare and the Year of Lear, called Lear the darkest tragedy that Shakespeare ever wrote, partly to do with the ending. Dr. Johnson pointed out that this ending is contrary to the natural ideas of justice, to the hope of the reader. It inverts, doesn't it, the classic fairy tale, because it doesn't end with the good sister prospering. And interestingly, though, Johnson went on to acknowledge that it was true to life. It's just a representation of the common events of human life, he says, even though we wanted justice. So I think he was acknowledging the truth of chaos and evil as well. How do you feel about the way that the play ends and what we're left with then?
It's interesting that the bit of the Johnson quote that you read out towards the end is not one that's usually quoted from him. about it feeling lifelike, even if it's unsupportable or unendurable. I feel there are similarly bad endings across Shakespeare, actually, particularly Othello, actually. I don't see any glimpse there, any glimpse whatsoever. In some respects, I struggle more with the end of Othello because we've seen that unravel in real time in a very different way than we do in Lear. We see the relationships. In some respects, I find Othello actually more painful.
We talked about the heartbreaking final scene with Lear and how there are variations of that, but it's still extraordinarily moving when he comes on with her body, and it's so poetically written as well. I suppose maybe there's some catharsis going on because of our heartbreaking empathy for that scene in some way. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sort of productively struggling with this question because the only time I've ever experienced catharsis at Lear was indeed this production in the Faroe Islands I keep on harking back to. But it was because the final lines and the death of Lear were completely reimagined. But I think in most conventional productions of Lear, I don't know what the takeaway is. And I think that might clue us into something that's interesting about the whole history of this play, in that we don't know how successful or popular it was in Shakespeare's time. We obviously have the recorded performance or two, but we don't know whether it was one of his greatest hits. And of course, we know that as soon as Civil War and the Restoration happened, then it became fair game to adapt. And what they did with it, what Nahum Tate did with it, obviously, was to give us a better sense of what to think when it had finished. And that's not to be gainsaid. There's the kind of vast condescension of posterity about this stuff. And we're taught to laugh at these 18th, 17th century people who rewrote Shakespeare. But I think there's something profound about that actually we want to know what we feel at the end of something like 3 hours. And to be left with this kind of uncertainty and dead weight. And of course, in some performances, it will change as well during your life. I mean, I can already see how this play will be different to me when I'm a bit older.
Do you think if it would be some empathy from a perspective of a father with the death of their daughter, for example?
Well, I remember seeing a gender-flipped production in California a few years ago. So it was Queen Lear, and everything was flipped over. So Queen Lear had 3 sons. And when she cradled her boy at the end of that, I thought about my own mum. And it completely changed the play from this slightly remote, angry patriarch that I struggle to always associate with to something very different. So productions can change the way we feel about the ending, but our own stage in the life cycle will absolutely change, and our own experience of difficult parents and difficult children.
Yes. And whether you have children and the death of children, that would you imagine that, would be insupportable.
Totally. Which is why it's a crazy play to do with high schoolers.
Yeah.
It's yet another crazy Shakespeare play to do with high schoolers.
Go back to my very beginning. They shouldn't have done it in my high school.
No, that was cruel and unusual.
And they also go back to the point you made about the bewilderment of those left standing around, because there is some doubt as to what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And that's borne out by the fact that the quarto and folio versions have different people speaking the final words, and we don't know whether it's Albany or Edgar or both of them or are going to rule from now on. So it's not all tied up neatly. So I think that uncertainty you talk about is hugely important, and it's part of the complete philosophical sense of the play, I think. It feels so rich and unresolved because it is many things at once, isn't it? It's a political house of cards, I suppose, a drama, intense drama of family relations, rivalry, but also with this sweeping kind of existential vision of a world unmoored by our own self-destructive behaviors. And it would seem in the absence of any reassuring moral order. Where are the gods? So it leaves us pretty adrift.
Yes. Not to get too topical, but I was listening to the philosopher Slavoj Žižek talk about the current state of the world. And he's interested in the work of the psychoanalyst Lacan. But he was saying from a Lacanian perspective, the problem now is that there is no big other. There is no big thing that is going to come in and save the world. There's nothing that we can all agree on might, as it were, bring us together. There is no world order. I'm just saying that it speaks to that angst, that there is nothing out there that's going to come in here and sort it all out.
All of which is that this is a play that seems very much still to speak to the current state of our world.
Yes, I wish it didn't.
400 years later.
Yeah.
Okay, Paul, wow, this has been amazing.
We've done well not to be daunted. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say.
Well done. We've tried anyway. I hope it turns out better for us. Before I let you go, one of the features of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play, one that's a personal favorite and that we might be able to do on the podcast at some time, but more just a personal favorite. Is there one you'd like to recommend to listeners that you particularly love?
Well, I assumed I'd be asked for a Shakespeare one, so I thought Shakespearean. And you haven't done Coriolanus, have you yet?
No, I have not. And in fact, I don't know it at all well. You've thrown the gauntlet down there.
Okay, it's really meaty, and it's not one that people would regularly come across. That's one of my favorites. When I was asked by American immigration services whether I was a Shakespearean and what my favorite play was, I decided to say that because I thought it would be a safe bet they hadn't heard of it, and therefore they would let me in.
Was there some way that your answer might prejudice your...
Well, quite.
Oh, my goodness, that's fantastic. Shakespeare still rules. Well, I will call you, Paul, then, for another 2-hour chat about Coriolanus.
We could probably do that in 1 hour 45.
Okay. You're on.
All right.
Thank you so much for all your time. It's been real fun. As the curtain falls on the devastation of these royal families and the turmoil in the Kingdom of Britain, it is difficult not to be dismayed at the bleakness of what we have witnessed. Certainly, many critics have highlighted the darkness of Shakespeare's vision, as it is a painful fact that the good characters do not prosper in this story. We also cannot deny the truth of much of this vision, our all too recognizable propensity to prey upon each other in pursuit of our own ambitions and desires, or the reality of our mental fragility in the face of disappointment, or finally an acknowledgement of the randomness of the universe. Yet Shakespeare does show us persistence of love and loyalty in the behavior of Cordelia and Gloucester and Kent, in Edgar's revenge on his brother, perhaps, and in Lear's humble reconciliation with his daughter. Values which I'm sure he means us to understand that the world would be a darker and more comfortless place without. Thanks for listening. See you next time. That's the best I could do.
It's very good.
There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.